Hello, welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here in Liliesleaf in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'm here with Muff Andersson, who is a former MK commander, former regional MK commander in Zimbabwe, and we're going to be talking about journalism, academics, and the armed struggle. Welcome, Muff.
Thank you very much, Steven.
Well, thank you for coming. Muff, you've had a very colorful history, as many people know.
I have indeed.
Yes, you have indeed. Would you say a word or two about kind of your journalism background and your academic background to some of your armed struggle work?
Sure. Well, I moved from, as a kid, I was very interested in creative writing, and I moved from there into journalism at quite an early age from school. I had a mentor who encouraged me to do journalism, and I went on what was called the Argus Cadet course, because at that age, at that stage, which was in the mid-70s, there were very few journalism courses. So I studied at the Star and I did an internship. I went to the Pretoria News, and then I was bought out of my contract by the Sunday Times. I did a column at the Sunday Times, and then I went into radio journalism from there. I worked on Capital Radio, and then something called the Press Trust of South Africa, which was a progressive news agency, which worked for the BBC, Deutsche Welle, and Radio Nederland.
When did you start basically deciding that you were going to get really involved in politics?
Okay, so that was before journalism and while I was doing journalism. I had worked, my very first job coming out of school was at the University of Witwatersrand. As a library clerk, my boss was Ilse Wilson, who's Bram Fischer's daughter. And her dad died while I was working there, and her stoicism and patience and kindness while he died really made an impact on me. I just couldn't believe that the regime could be so cruel as to not let her attend the funeral. And you know, I learned all about Bram Fischer's commitment and so on. And then when I moved into journalism, I tried to use the journalism to do something. Like my first ever interview for my exams was interviewing Percy Kuboza, who was the editor of The World, about the 76 uprisings. And I met various people in 1977 who were involved with black consciousness and so on. And it was very politicizing period. And as a music columnist, I traveled to Botswana. I met with, where my parents lived, in fact, I met with Wally Soroti, who was working for the ANC, Tami Manyeli. And I got recruited actually into the ANC structures, which were then the ANC cultural structures. And people were working, this is in late 79, early 1980s, they were working towards a cultural and resistance symposium, which was going to take place in, I think, early 1982. And at that point, what they were trying to do was just simply organize cultural workers. That was the term. Rather than artists, the term was cultural workers. So writers, artists, architects, various strands of artists to come together and to work not just in terms of portraying oppression in their work, but portraying resistance. So instead of just putting pictures on the wall which showed how apartheid treated people badly, to show how people resisted apartheid, and also working with people. So in other words, not just hanging art in galleries, but putting art amongst the people. So where people were resisting, painting with people, singing with people, which is in fact more an African way of doing things, because with African art, audiences are not very much separated from production. You have audiences like call and response with music. You don't really have a situation where there's much separation. If people are singing, the audience is not standing back and clapping. There's a situation where people are singing and audience respond, right? So it's very much a Western thing where people sit back and listen and clap. So it was pretty much responding, bringing back an African element into the art. Nothing very subversive about the ANC cultural structures. It was something about trying to take art back, cultural work back to people, and that's what I was doing in those ANC cultural structures until 1981, when I was called into exile after my brother had been detained, and I was called into exile, and that's when I took the decision to go to MK. I was given the choice of studying or going into MK.
And when you decided to go into MK, did you think about it for a long time, or you said, I'm just ready to do it?
What happened is that Mac Maharaj came to me and he said, do you want to study or do you want to go into MK? And it was an instantaneous decision to go into MK. I can tell you the reason. I thought that I would be better suited to MK because they typically looked for black men in MK. That was a stereotype. And I thought, well, I don't look like a black man, so maybe I can be more useful.
Well, when I first learned about your background in MK, that's the very first thing I thought of as well. I thought, this is very interesting. So here's a woman who's essentially distributing weapons during the anti-apartheid era, but if you were walking down the street anywhere, most places in South Africa, no one would pay any attention.
Yes. Well, that's the whole point.
How do you think about, in retrospect now, I suppose some people could call you a freedom fighter, some people could call you a terrorist, some people could say, well, you shouldn't have done what you did. I assume you've had some reflections on that.
It was a struggle for human rights. People were being mown down in the streets. You can't call people terrorists who were trying to assist in a freedom struggle. You've got no idea what the conditions were like at the time. You've got absolutely no idea of what the conditions were like in the 70s and 80s and the levels of torture that people were going through. It was simply a question of trying to assist people in a freedom struggle. Now, the other thing was that it wasn't just a question of guns, it was a question of like limpet mines and so on. Ours was not a struggle of trying to, it was a defensive struggle. So, for example, we were not trying to blow up like people and so on. We were, the targets that were being attacked by MK, it was not, we were not aiming to kill, not Massive Life or something. We were not ISIS. This was not like about beheading people or something like that. The point at which I joined MK, it was about economic targets. It was about putting limpets on things that were going to cause damage to economic targets. okay? That was the issue. It was not about maximum taking of life. The struggle changed into people's war at a later stage, and I was fully behind that, about arming self-defense units. The struggle changed, and I was totally pro arming self-defense units as police occupied townships and were killing children. There had to be some way of fighting back. Children had nothing to protect themselves. Nobody had anything to protect themselves. This was not terrorism.
I hear what you're saying. I wonder if today, in retrospect, people might say, well, perhaps there was another way to fight the struggle.
What other way? What other way was there, Stephen? Police had armed police were in the townships. White armed police, white armed soldiers were in the township killing black people. So now the only hope was that an army of the people had to come to their defense. What other way was there?
Well, I believe that Nelson Mandela extolled the virtues many years later of negotiations.
Yes, but that was many years later. You know, obviously I was part of the team that got involved in negotiations. I was part of the peacekeeping force. I was a spokesperson for the National Peacekeeping Force. I was the first spokesperson for the Ministry of Defense after integration. I was part of all of that. That was when we decided upon negotiations. So, you know, we had got to that point in 1994. 1993, as I said, when we formed the National Peacekeeping Force, I was part of that, but that was the point at which there was a decision in the Transitional Executive Committee that we had decided, yes, we have to have these negotiations, but at that point before they had taken the decision, there was absolutely no way that these things could continue. The slaughter, this mass slaughter.
Well, in terms of continuing, one of the things that intrigued me about your background, and not only you, but a lot of the MK folks, was that, if I understood it correctly, the arms smuggling that was taking place through the safari truck was actually taking place even while the Cadessa negotiations were going on.
Yes, because there was a war going on in KwaZulu-Natal. There was a war going on started by the IFP and the apartheid regime, and involving the security police, and in fact that was possibly the most brutal time, and more people were killed at that period than in the earlier period of apartheid. And so while these negotiations were starting, hundreds and thousands of people were killed in that period. But we got amnesty for that.
And I believe you were one of the first one or two women who were given amnesty by the TRC, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right.
And when you applied for amnesty, how did that work?
Okay, so what do you mean, how did it work?
Well, what did you say in your application?
We said that we applied for amnesty for smuggling weapons after the cut-off date, because the cut-off date was 1991, and we had continued to supply weapons because of that war that was going on, and the slaughter of people by the IFP and the state.
Now that it's many years later, in the academic arena, how many people who you interact with in the academic world fully appreciate and understand what you did during the anti-apartheid era?
I think most of them, some people don't know what I did at all because they only see me as an academic. There are some extremely right-wing academics who have a go at me all the time, and if you look online, you'll see there are people who say extremely awful things about me and have in public said terrible things about me. When I go to speak, there are people who've shut me down in seminars, even when I'm talking about literature, African literature.
What do you think about the issue of the free speech movement now? As you know, there's a tremendous movement around the world. We don't want to offend certain people by certain speech. Do you have any thoughts about that movement?
I'm completely pro-free speech, but I'm very wary of hate speech. In this country, we've seen a lot of hate speech, a lot of racist speech, and I'm very wary of hate speech that hurts people. I'm fine if they want to say things about me. Let them say things about me. I don't mind. It's their business. If they want to think of me as a terrorist, it's absolutely fine. They can say it. I wouldn't try to shut them down. Let them say it. But I think they're wrong. I don't think it's true. But where I would fight them is if they start saying racist things about people, because I think that needs to be shut down. If they start using the K word and so on about people, I would fight that, because that's what I have fought my entire life. I would certainly fight that. I wouldn't stop, because I think that's a human rights issue. So that's why I draw the distinction.
Well, and who gets to draw that distinction between hate speech, human rights, and free speech?
Well, we've got a Freedom of Expression Institute here, so I think they're pretty good. They can draw that distinction. We've got a fantastic constitution. We've got institutions in place that can take these decisions. We've got. I think we're all pretty clear. We're all pretty clear in our heads of what is free speech and what's hate speech. We know. People let it go when something's just people being rude and ugly, and people get very fed up when it's harsh and disgusting speech. When people start saying baboons and people start saying the K word and so on, or the N word, and we all know if it's a black person calling another black person N word, we know it can be jocular, it can be within rap songs and all this kind of stuff. We know it's okay. If it's a white person doing it, we know it's not okay. We understand these things, we're smart. How free speech works is complex, but audiences are very smart. Audiences, popular audiences, really do understand these kind of things.
And speaking of popular audiences, have you addressed audiences in the United States?
Actually, yes. Yale University. I was invited in about 2005 to speak to students and do a bit of teaching about mass audiences in Africa, and exactly that, about the sophistication of mass audiences in Africa. I spoke on genre studies. I did a project on guerrilla audiences, called Guerrilla Audiences, about new forms of audiences in South Africa, in Africa, about stand-up comedy, which is very popular in Africa and very exciting. There you get like very spicy, critical, satirical comedy, which is no holds barred comedy, and very critical of governments, and which is allowed, and different forms, graphic comics, books, popular novels, different forms of occult videos, popular TV programs, soap opera, local soap opera, which has just taken off like this through Africa. I actually did my master's on soap opera. There are a lot of soapies in South Africa, which I find a subversive form. The reason being, it's beneath contempt as far as the censors are concerned.
Beneath contempt?
Yeah. So people don't really look like, if the censors are looking for, in Africa, if the censors are looking for things to come down on, like where things might be critical, those governments in Africa which might, all around the world, where they're looking for things that might be critical of the government, they don't look at soap opera. And soap opera is often very critical because in soap opera the workers can often overturn the bosses, and there's a lot of people being very critical of the government, and you know, the women rule, they're very strong, and it's an upside down world.
That's interesting you say that, because in your first book, if I remember correctly, and I think it was Music in the Mix.
Yeah.
And in that, you had some areas in that when you were talking about the subversive elements of music.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting that you explored that many years later in terms of the soap operas.
Yes.
That's an interesting thread.
Okay.
Am I not dreaming that, or?
No, you're not dreaming that. You're not dreaming that. I probably continue that theme in all my work.
And did it continue in your PhD thesis?
The PhD thesis was a bit different in that I was looking at intertextuality in film and TV. So I was looking at in modern film and TV the way texts talk to one another. So Robert Stam said any text that has slept with another text has automatically or has naturally slept with all the texts the other text has slept with. In other words, there's so much referencing and inter-referencing. And it's for the purpose of audiences again, to reach audiences. So you see one film and there's a bit of a reference to another film, and it makes audiences feel comfortable.
Well, I suppose that's how human knowledge is advanced.
Exactly. Umberto Eco says, everything is the already said. Nothing is purely original.
Well, and speaking of nothing being purely original, I mean, to get back to the issue of the gun running, I suppose somebody could say, you know, people have been doing that for a long time, not just in South Africa.
Of course.
And that if you follow that logical thing, well, depending on who you ask, again, either you're the terrorist or you're the freedom fighter. I suppose, and one could say that about anybody who's involved in any struggle that's involving any weapons of any sort.
I don't know. I mean, as I explained, it's, for me, I'm a freedom fighter. So it's semantics.
Fair enough. I think we have a few minutes left. What would you like to say to people at Yale or anywhere else in the United States who are now kind of looking back at the anti-apartheid era? What would you like them to think about now? Obviously, I spend a lot of time in South Africa. I'm comfortable here. I used to live here. But the average American hasn't.
Okay, I think this is an exciting country. I think people might say, oh, rand dips and so on, but it's an incredibly exciting country to come through. We have gross unemployment. That is bad. We've got to attend to that. But there's a liveliness and excitement in this country. There are great things going on. When you do come here and you get like a young person to show you around the streets and the places and so on, I think there's a lot to learn, because it's a country sort of coming alive. You can only really feel a country coming alive after 20 or 25 years. It's new. There are things growing and developing, and you know, people are waking up and understanding things about the environment, understanding things about architecture. There are new ideas, new fashions. People are starting to get a sense of their Africanness that were really suppressed under apartheid. The music, the culture, all the things that we looked for earlier, you know, the literature, everything's starting to bloom. I think it's very exciting. If you go to all the museums and so on, they're very different from anything people will have seen in America. They're very different from anything people will have seen in England, in Europe. The other thing is freedom of expression. These things, people speak out. It's really open. It's a very, very open society. It's not a suppressed society. You know, kids have friends of all different colors. It's not a racist society generally. Racists get called out very quickly. And our parliament is open. It's not a white society. I'm feeling very happy. I'm feeling very positive about being here. I'm very happy I participated in the struggle. I'm very proud. I like the food.
Well, Muff, thank you so much for your time today. If you would like additional information about higher education today, please send an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.